Summary historians face a challenge in trying to understand the recurrent unity of Zhonghua, or of what in English we call China. When compared with the failure of other antique empires to maintain their existence into the modern age, the longevity of the Chinese state seems to be something of an anomaly. The historical usage of the term Han is highly unstable, and even in the contemporary world the term can be slippery. Sometimes it is used synonymously with Chinese, sometimes not. There is a long and lively debate over who the true Han people are and where they came from. In short, it is hard to escape the conclusion that Han is one of many untidy terms that encumber the world we live in. The goal of this chapter is not to answer the question, who are the Han? But to ask, why is Han used to talk about the people we know as the Chinese? In other words, how has Han acquired the sense of an ethnic identifier? What does this category mean today, and what has it meant in the past? This chapter offers two main conclusions. First, the development of Han as an ethnonym owed greatly to the intervention of the Hu, the nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples living to the north of the Central Plains. Second, I would suggest that the ethnic unity of the Chinese as seen in the adoption of Han to describe themselves is really the product of repeated efforts to create and foster political unity. In the interim, Han was applied to all kinds of people, some of whom we would regard as Chinese and others decidedly not. The notion of a durable, unified conception of the Han people as a people dating back millennia is largely a myth. We must remember to ask why this term and not that, and at the same time move beyond mere words to understand why it is being described in a particular way at a particular time. The Han are sometimes claimed to be the largest ethnic group on Earth. Is this true? Not, but is it an ethnic group at all? The answer is to this question will depend greatly on what one means by ethnic group and how one understands ethnicity and other kinds of identity formation. Ethnic phenomena are found in many places in the human historical record, including in the pre-modern era and even antiquity. To be ethnic, a group must lay down certain expectations of its members in terms of action, expectations that are not applied to those outside the group and may even be forbidden to them. This is not to say that people do not move in and out of ethnic groups, whether temporarily or for their whole lives. But doing so involves costs, losses as well as gains, and in this double sense is also transactional. The above approach to ethnicity, as both subject of analysis and as critical concept, is echoed in a wide range of works. Ethnicity was understood sociologically, not anthropologically, as a way of treating identity discourse generally. As the dominant group, the Han were by definition denied the possibility of being ethnic at all. We find that this older paradigm prevails still in work by Chinese scholars, where to be ethnic is to be a Minzu. Minzu and related terms tend to reflect the older English meaning of minority ethnic. The newer, constructionist or circumstantialist notion of ethnicity is signified by a different word in Chinese, the neologism Zuchuan. This term might be applied even to dominant groups, which, no less than minority groups, also engage in identity making that can legitimately be regarded as ethnic. The powerful are as capable of rousing ethnic sentiments among their number in the defense of privilege as the weak are in the protest of it. The question then arises, who is or was the other to the Han self? Seeking an answer to this question must be regarded as an important part of developing a critical approach to the study of the formation of Han identity. We know that the popular idea of a China cut off from the world, hiding behind walls great and small, is an utter myth. China, or what would later become China, has known many others. Not being separated by impassable natural barriers, interaction between peoples on all sides was an integral part of their lived experience. Among China's various others, the most important in terms of understanding the story of Han ethnogenesis have been nomadic pastoralists living north of the Central Plains. As I attempt to show, the initial work to transform Han from a political to an ethnic term was done by the Hu, and the further development of the term owed much to its use by later Hu groups. Han began to be used as a label for Central States people in the 4th century. The term was variously employed in the Tang and Song, and used with different meanings again under the Liao, Jin, and Yuan. By the Ming, Han had begun to acquire something like its modern meaning, in that it had become a single referent for southern and northern Chinese alike. The emergence of the Han as a single ethnic group was not so much the basis for Chinese unity as a consequence of it. Ultimately, the process of generating Han can be seen as one that permitted the bridging of the long-standing divide between North and South. The name Han derives from the Han River Hanshui, which flows from modern Shaanxi through to Hubei. Han originated in the Han period but as a political identifier, not an ethnonym. Other words existed that carried a sense of the group's cultural self-definition. After the fall of the Han in the early 3rd century, those terms persisted, while Hanren largely fell out of use. The only people who remained Hanren were the subjects of the Rump Han state that arose in Sichuan. The revival of the term Hanren seems to have occurred under the Sarbai Xianbei rulers of the state of Wei. In short, the Northern Wei represented the resurgence of Hu power in the period of disunity. The Northern Wei ruler Xiaowen R. 47199 adopted a policy of wholesale acculturation. He moved the capital south to Luoyang, promoting the wearing of Chinese-style clothing. He also changed Sarbai names to Chinese names, embracing the literary heritage of the Central Plains. The Northern Wei regime remained, despite broad evidence of acculturation, alien and mistrusted. Leading Northern Wei Chinese elites shared the general attitudes of people such as Jiang Tong and chafed at Sarbai rule. It was in part out of a desire to address these issues and not owing to an irresistible urge to become Chinese. The move was based in part on a selective reinterpretation of the classics. Northern Wei adoption of the rites of Zhou should be seen as a consciously archaizing maneuver. A key element of this universalizing program was to find a proper place for the Sarbai in a Chinese world. As for Hu, this was a term that the Northern Wei scrupulously avoided using to describe itself. From the Sarbai point of view, who were others, less civilized and deserving of a lower place in the hierarchy. Their establishment of a barbarian's hostile Siiguan in Luoyang was one sign of this attitude. This had obvious appeal to the Tabgak, who had begun to form a consciousness of Zhonghua that was distinct from a worldview that had Han at its center. The success of this enlarged vision of empire required not only resolving the lingering tension between Hu and Hua but also dissolving the identification between the terms Hua and Zhongguoren. Hainer, man of Han, means inhabitants of the Central Plains, that is, Chinese. Hanren also shows up in a discussion of Buddhism in the Weishu. From now on, if anyone dares to serve the Hu gods by making statues of clay and bronze, they will be executed along with their entire family. In Ziji Tongjian, Sima Guang refers to the wish of the Northern Wei ruler to remove the crown prince because he is no longer like us and has taken on the qualities of the Han. In his commentary, Hu Sanqing 12301302 explained to the reader, the Xianbei called the people of the central country Han. The quotation from the Weishu cited above, in particular the phrase Qianshi Hanren, offers a clue as to the transformation of the term Han. One possible understanding of this phrase is that it means a Han person of a former age, that is, a former Han subject. But since the figure of Lu Jinyuan mentioned in the passage is identifiable as a Buddhist monk of the late 4th century, he was clearly not alive during the Han. As we have few attestations of Hanren being used in this way before this time, it is difficult to know among which circles this habit may have been sustained. At a minimum, however, these citations make clear that distinguishing between Hu and Hua, from the point of view of the Northern Wei, was everyday practice. We can think of Hu or the much more offensive Lu or Yi as Chinese names for the Northern other. Han or the less complimentary Hainer was the Sarbai name for the local other in the Central Lands. But the Northern Wei attempt to reframe the discourse of civilization was only partially successful, and they certainly never managed to reunify the world. There are only 3 occurrences of the word in the Suishu, all clearly associated with stories from the Han period. When the meaning was Chinese, it seems, Hua remained the word of choice. But beginning in the 10th century, Han took on new meanings that considerably exceeded those it had acquired up to that time. The employment of the terms Han and Hanren in the cismural states or conquest dynasties of Liao, Jin, and Yuan, is much better known and more widely studied than it is in preceding periods. The major reorganization of identity categories occasioned by the dramatic political shifts of the 11th through 13th centuries suggests that there were significant incongruencies with preceding and later norms. Early in the dynasty, the Liao began to use Hainer to describe ethnic Chinese whether or not they were Liao subjects. Later on they discriminated more carefully, using Hanren or Hainer only for former Song subjects whom they had captured and brought under their authority. As for Song, they regarded Liao Hainer as little better than the Khitan themselves. When the Jin defeated the Liao and drove back the Song armies, according to the Treaty of 1142, they also took over those territories north of the Huai River that had once belonged to Song. In these altered circumstances, the new Jin rulers continued Liao usage by calling the Chinese subjects of the El Shao they inherited Hanren, and sometimes Yanren. Former Song subjects who had not been part of Liao were called Nanren. Zhu Shi explained the difference as follows: Goizheng people are those who were originally from the Central Plain and who fell under barbarian rule. They have escaped wickedness and returned to rectitude. Once again, as in the Northern Way, the fact of Northern rule had forced a redefinition of who the Han were. Hanren in the Yuan included all those who had been Hanren or Hainer in the Liao and Jin. It included essentially all former Song subjects now under the sway of the Mongol Khan. This meant an assortment of at least 8 different groups including Khitans, Jurchens, Bohai, Kaguryo. In the Yuan, Nanren meant Chinese and Hanren meant Northerner. Had Yuan rule lasted longer, or had the Mongols not defeated the Song, it is conceivable that Chinese people today would be calling themselves the Nanzu or Songzu. The reassertion of southern political power in the shape of the Ming dynasty overturned once and for all the onomastic conventions of the Yuan world. To what degree the categories imposed by the Yuan for administrative purposes had come to affect individual identities is something we know little about and deserves further study. It must have been quite disorienting to Northerners to discover that Hanren suddenly meant not just them but all the Nanren, too. The Mongols had prepared the way by pushing a broadening of Han a century earlier. Zhu was broadening it yet again in one direction by expanding Han to include Southerners. In the establishment of a kind of equivalence between Han and Hua, the later term enjoying very broad use in the Ming, we see the closing of the distance between ethno-cultural and political administrative terms. A further adumbration of the term along these lines occurs in the 17th century, when Han was used as an ethno-administrative classification applied to the Chinese forces fighting with the Manchus. If the story presented here is approximately correct, it is probably sounder historically to regard the common identity shared by Hanren today very much as an early modern artifact. The evolution of the term Han is by no means linear. The difficult and sometimes contradictory negotiations that continue today between being Han and being Chinese are but the latest twist in a historical process stretching back to the 6th century. Now, as then, the other has played a role that is, in every sense, critical.